Imagine for a moment this scenario. A really street-smart, no-nonsense guy straight out of Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Someone who lives by instinct, by what works on the ground.
Okay, got it.
And he's debating the greatest philosopher of ancient Greece, Socrates, right?
Yeah.
A man whose whole thing was relentless questioning, demanding definitions for everything.
Wow, yeah. What would that even sound like?
Exactly. Would it just be a total mismatch? Like one side completely lost? Or, and this is the interesting part, could it actually be this profound meeting of minds, something that challenges everything we think we know about wisdom?
That's a fascinating picture. It'd be this almost paradoxical exchange, wouldn't it? An encounter that really forces you to reconsider the nature of truth itself.
And the limits of pure logic, maybe?
Totally. The limits of rationality and, how we actually navigate a world that's way more complex than our neat little logical boxes often suggest. And this isn't just some, intellectual game.
Right.
It's really about understanding how to make better decisions day to day in a reality that's fundamentally unpredictable.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we don't just skim the surface. We really try to unpack complex ideas, distill the most fascinating insights, and hopefully give you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
And today we are embarking on a pretty deep dive into excerpts from Nassim Taleb's Antifragile. It's a book that radically challenges a lot of conventional wisdom.
It really does. It redefines how we think about risk, about knowledge, even about life itself. Our mission today is to try and pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge you need to navigate this complex, unpredictable world.
Yeah, a world where often the rules of the game are kind of hidden and where what you don't know, paradoxically, can sometimes be your biggest strength.
So our sources today, they're these rich discussions and direct excerpts from Antifragile itself. It gives you this unique blend, I think.
Definitely. It's part philosophical inquiry, part really practical wisdom, and it takes this critical, almost provocative look at modern institutions.
We're going to explore core concepts,
Right.
like the barbell strategy.
Which is revolutionary in itself.
Yeah. And we'll delve into that hypothetical debate, which is just brilliant, between Fat Tony, the streetwise guy, and the relentless Socrates.
And examine why, in the real world, the payoff often matters so much more than abstract truth.
It's a journey that'll make you question your own assumptions, I think.
Yeah.
About how you learn, how you decide, maybe even how you thrive.
Absolutely. Should be fascinating.
Okay, let's dive in. The first big idea, the barbell strategy. Now, this sounds counterintuitive right off the bat, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because we're always told, balance is key. Moderation is the way.
Yeah.
In your diet, your investments, your daily routine, whatever.
The middle path, yeah.
But Taleb seems to be saying something completely different. It's not about finding a middle ground at all, is it?
Not really, no. And what's truly fascinating, I think, is that Taleb argues that true balance, or that sort of moderate, middle-of-the-road approach, it can actually be quite fragile in certain situations.
Fragile. How so?
Well, think about it like this. If you try to spread your resources thinly across, lots of moderate options, you might feel diversified, right?
Yeah, seems sensible.
But often, you're just exposing yourself to a whole series of small, manageable risks that, they can add up, or they can all fail together in some unpredictable way. So instead, he proposes the barbell strategy. It's this powerful metaphor for robust living and decision-making.
Okay, so the core idea
Yeah.
is that, you secure one part of your life, make it extremely conservative, super low risk.
Exactly. Your safe base.
And then at the same time, you expose another part, maybe a smaller part, to extreme, potentially unlimited upside.
Precisely. That's why he calls it a barbell. You've got these heavy, stable weights at either end, the very safe and the potentially very high reward, and very little in that vulnerable middle.
Ah, okay. So you're minimizing your downside risk, but maximizing your shot at those huge, disproportionate gains.
You got it. That conventional wisdom of just balancing out everything, Taleb argues it often creates this illusion of routine and safety, which is maybe fine if you live in what he calls mediocristing.
Mediocristin,
Yeah.
right? Where things cluster around the average, human height or how many calories people eat a day.
Yeah, exactly. In mediocristin, a single outlier, one really tall person or one day of eating a lot, it doesn't fundamentally change the whole system. But the real world, especially in areas like finance, technology, complex social systems,
Mm.
that operates more like Extremistan.
And Extremistan is where the wild stuff happens.
Yeah.
The highly improbable but massively impactful events, the black swans he talks about.
Right, those rare, high-impact, totally unpredictable things that only in hindsight seem kind of obvious.
Like the rise of the internet, maybe, or the 2008 crash, or even big scientific breakthroughs.
Perfect examples. In Extremistan, a single outlier event can change everything, which makes those traditional risk models, the ones based on averages and normal distributions, almost useless.
Because they assume a mediocristan world.
Exactly. And in that kind of Extremistan environment, that moderate middle-of-the-road approach, the one that tries to absorb everything bit by bit, that can be the most vulnerable.
So Taleb suggests instead a secure conservative base,
Oh.
plus this aggressive high-upside exposure that's actually more resilient.
Far more resilient and potentially far more beneficial than trying to find some delicate balance that might just shatter under extreme pressure. This strategy isn't just about managing risk either.
Yeah. Well,
It's fundamentally about cultivating optionality.
optionality, meaning
Meaning having the right, but not the obligation, to take advantage of good situations when they pop up without being forced to deal with their downsides if they don't work out. It's really a blueprint for living in a chaotic world.
what's really hitting me about the barbell strategy is how it goes way beyond just financial advice. It feels like a fundamental way to approach uncertainty in, well, almost any part of life.
Oh, absolutely.
How does Taleb show its broader application? Like, outside of just investments, what about, say, education? How does this strategy work when you think about learning?
Okay, yeah, education's a great example. In education, the barbell strategy would suggest that one side, the secure base, should be what society generally expects, like getting a guaranteed education, obtaining a conventional degree.
The safety net, the
That-
credentials.
Right, the thing that serves as a baseline, something for societal calls, as the source puts it. It's the secure side, making sure you have that basic level of knowledge and a recognized qualification.
Got it. The guaranteed minimum, the acceptable standard. But where's the other end of the barbell? Where's the unlimited upside? The extremist end of education.
Ah, the unlimited upside. That comes from, well, unconventional sources and really active intellectual curiosity. Think about the, infinite potential you might find in a library.
Or just one amazing book that completely changes how you see things.
Exactly. Or having deep conversations with truly interesting intellectual people. Anything that significantly broadens your ideas and exposes you to stuff outside the standard curriculum.
So not just formal schooling.
Right. The source specifically mentions things like audiobooks and videos as modern ways to access that other high upside side of intellectual exploration. It's about embracing curiosity without limits, really allowing for those serendipitous discoveries.
I see. So it's not just about sitting passively in a classroom. It's about actively seeking those infinite potential moments that a fixed curriculum might just miss. Because that's often where the truly transformative insights are hiding.
You nailed it. It reminds me of that example in the book Nero Tulip. Remember him?
Vaguely.
Yeah.
The guy who sticks to his rigid schedule.
Yeah. Never meets new people, avoids anything unexpected. His life is totally predictable, zero exposure to random, beneficial stuff. Compare that to someone who gets an unexpected free invitation to a party in London.
Right. Nero wouldn't go.
Probably not. But the person with the invitation, they have an option. A free, potentially advantageous upside they can choose to take or decline. That's the core of the barbell in life. Secure predictability on one end.
And pure asymmetric upside optionality on the other.
Exactly. You are protected from the worst outcomes, but you're positioned to jump on unexpected opportunities. And this principle, it goes beyond education too, of course, like in finance.
Yeah. How does it look there?
Well, a classic barbell in finance might be having, say, 80 or 90% of your assets in super safe, low volatility things like treasury bills or inflation index bonds. Ultra conservative.
Yeah. The secure end.
And then a much smaller chunk, maybe 10 or 20%, is exposed to highly speculative, high potential stuff like venture capital, early stage tech startups, things that could go to zero right, huge potential upside, limited downside because it's only a small part of your portfolio.
And it extends to just life and optionality itself, like publishing a book, maybe. You put in the work, that's the secure base of creating it.
Yeah, the effort is known.
But the infinite upside potential, how it's received, who reads it, what connections it makes, what doors it opens, you can never know that in advance.
That's pure optionality right there. It's the core principle. One aspect of your life has to be secured, absolutely solid. while the other aspect, expose it to infinite open look, you consciously build in that potential for positive surprises.
It's about designing your life to minimize the bad shocks while maximizing the good ones, even in areas like, say, health and fitness.
Absolutely. Think about the gym. The limited, secure side would be making consistent, small, safe improvements, like adding just 50-gram only, 100 grams only to your lifts, as the source mentions, tiny increments.
So avoiding big, risky jumps that could lead to injury, but steady, almost invisible progress that builds a robust base over time.
Exactly. Secure, steady growth, building strength and resilience incrementally, avoiding injury, avoiding burnout. That's the safe end.
Okay, so what's the unlimited side of health? Where's the extremist stand there? Is it like suddenly discovering a miracle diet or something?
Maybe not quite like that, but the source implies that this steady, consistent improvement, this avoidance of fragility through robust, disciplined health practices, can lead to an infinite advantage at the healthy level.
Meaning?
It hints at the potential for, well, breakthrough resilience, radical improvement perhaps, or simply avoiding the thousands of things that can go wrong if your health is fragile and unexamined. It's about building a base that lets you absorb shocks, recover quickly.
And then maybe being open to unexpected leaps in energy or capability that come from that robust health.
That seems to be the idea. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, the barbell is such a powerful metaphor because it forces us to reconsider how we approach risk and opportunity.
Not just in money.
Not just in money, but in how we learn, how we stay healthy, even how we structure our daily lives. It encourages us to stop chasing that illusion of a perfectly balanced, often fragile middle ground.
And instead embrace intelligent asymmetry. Put your safety eggs in one basket and your crazy potential eggs in another.
Something like that, yeah. It's a really compelling framework.
It absolutely is. And it sets the stage perfectly for where we're going next. This incredible clash of ideas that really gets at the heart of theoretical knowledge versus practical, lived wisdom.
Ah, yes, the main event.
Let's talk about one of the most intriguing thought experiments in Taleb's work.
Yeah.
The hypothetical showdown between Fat Tony and Socrates. This sounds like it could be a philosophical cage match.
It really does, doesn't it? And this section is, it's truly brilliant because it lets us explore that profound difference between what Taleb calls narrated intelligible knowledge.
Kind you get from books, lectures, definitions.
Right. And this other, more opaque kind that is entirely proved by action. This tacit, intuitive understanding that doesn't actually need to be spelled out to be effective. It fundamentally challenges the idea that everything has a clear, easily definable reason behind it.
Okay, let's set the scene properly. First, Socrates, the ultimate questioner, right? Always trying to get to the bottom of things, even if it meant, well, annoying everyone around him.
Definitely rub people the wrong way.
The source introduces him as the first philosopher in the modern sense. Hugely influential, even though he left no writings himself. We know him mostly through Plato and Xenophon, his students.
Right, which is interesting in itself. His ideas are already filtered.
Yeah. And the source mentions his famous trial. He was charged with corrupting the youth, introducing new gods. Pretty serious stuff. And get this, he didn't charge fees. It says he'd sometimes pay for people to listen to him. That's how committed he was.
Incredible dedication to the pursuit of truth, or at least questioning. His method, the Socratic method, was all about dialogue. He'd get people to agree to a series of seemingly simple statements.
Lead them down the garden path.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And then, through relentless questioning, he'd reveal the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the profound lack of clarity in their own thinking. His goal was always to elucidate concepts, strip away assumptions, get to that pure definition.
And he really disliked writing, didn't he?
Hated it, apparently. He believed that answers are never final and should not be fixed, that nothing should be written in stone. He preferred the living, breathing process of dialogue.
He sounds like a challenging guy to hang out with, almost abrasive in his intellectual honesty. The source even describes his looks as unprepossessing. Pot belly, skinny limbs, bulging eyes, snub nose, maybe even bad BO.
Doesn't paint the prettiest picture.
But despite all that, he had this incredible presence, this personal confidence, this amazing serenity of mind that just drew in these young Athenian men eager for the intellectual sparring.
It shows that real influence often comes from something deeper than looks, right? Intellectual gravity. Now, okay, let's bring in his counterpoint, Fat Tony.
The man himself.
His character, much like Socrates, is presented as maybe a bit distorted by his own biographer, this character Nero. kind of like Plato shaping our view of Socrates. But Tony's insights, they're described as productive, leading him to a life of leisure.
So he's successful in his own way.
Very. And interestingly, there are shared traits with Socrates. Both had leisure time, both loved arguing and conversation as entertainment, and both disliked writing.
For different reasons.
Completely different. For Tony, it wasn't some deep philosophical stance against fixed knowledge. He just almost flunked out of high school in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and found writing a pain. Purely practical.
Huh. Okay, so similar lifestyle, shared dislike of writing, but totally different approaches to thinking. Tony's core power, it says, is that he never lets other people frame the question.
Crucial point.
He teaches that the answer is planted in every question. And his rule, never respond with a straight answer to a question that makes no sense to you. That's powerful, isn't it? A practical defense mechanism.
It's the absolute opposite of Socrates' relentless hunt for definitions. It's a shield against getting dragged into meaningless intellectual loops. The book then brilliantly reimagines the Euthyphro dialogue.
Where Socrates grills the guy about the definition of piety.
That's the one. Socrates just keeps pushing Euthyphro for a precise definition, and the original dialogue just fizzles out because they can't reach one. It perfectly shows Socrates' frustration with fuzzy thinking.
So how does Fat Tony handle Socrates' definitional demands in this hypothetical rematch? I'm picturing Socrates leaning in. Tell me, Tony, what is piety?
Tony doesn't even play Socrates' game. Instead of trying to define piety, he just sidesteps with these completely practical, almost folksy analogies that totally derail Socrates' method. He might fire back, Socrates, let me ask you something. Does a baby need to define mother's milk, know its chemical makeup, its nutritional value to understand it needs to drink it to live?
Huh. And Socrates, being honest, would have to say.
No, he does not need to. He'd concede the point.
And then comes the dog analogy. Tony, maybe taking a drag from a cigar, asks, does a dog need to define owner or loyalty to be fiercely loyal to his master?
And Socrates, staying logical, would likely reply that dogs act on instinct. They don't need reflection or definition for that.
Okay, so Tony sets him up.
And then delivers the knockout. He argues, okay, humans aren't dogs, fine, but are we completely stripped off instincts, leading us to do things we have no clue about? He challenges the whole premise of Socrates' questioning. Why do we need to limit life to what we can answer in Proto-Brooklyn English or any fancy language?
Wow.
Tony's provocation is sharp and cuts right to his core philosophy. Only suckers wait for answers. Questions are not made for the answers. He's suggesting that this endless questioning without leading to useful action can just be a waste of time, a trap.
That is a direct shot at Socrates' most famous line, right? An unexamined life is not worth living. And his whole drive to reflect and understand what we are doing, Tony sees that approach as not just maybe pointless, but actively harmful.
He does. Fat Tony's sort of patronizing accusation about why Socrates ended up getting executed. It's incredibly profound. Tony claims Socrates was killed because he made people feel stupid for blindly following habits, instincts, and traditions. Yeah. He was destroying people's illusion about themselves, taking the joy of ignorance out of the things we don't understand, and crucially, he offered no answer to offer them in return, just expose their lack of definition.
So, for Fat Tony, the key insight is,
life is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a mystery to be lived. Questions don't always need answers, and trying to define everything can actually strip away useful, unspoken knowledge and those deep-seated heuristics that have helped us survive for ages.
it really forces you to ask that question. Is it a mistake to confuse the unintelligible for the unintelligent? It's like that other Taleb point, mistaking absence of evidence for evidence of absence.
Exactly. It's like the famous green lumber problem Taleb talks about. This incredibly successful trader made a fortune trading green lumber.
Right, I remember this.
But when asked what green lumber actually was, he said, oh, it's lumber that's painted green, not seasoned. He had no clue that green lumber technically means freshly cut timber, regardless of color.
But he knew how to trade it.
Precisely. He knew what it did in the market. He understood its practical behavior, its implications for his trades. He didn't need the academic definition to master its practical use. It's that huge difference between knowing how and knowing why that Tony embodies.
That practical, action-oriented knowledge.
And the source then brilliantly brings in Nietzsche's critique of Socratic rationalism.
No.
It really adds this deep historical layer to Tony's point.
Nietzsche, right, the Apollonian and the Dionysian.
Exactly. Nietzsche introduced this idea of two fundamental forces in ancient Greek culture. The Apollonian, that's the measured, balanced, rational, self-restrained side. Order, clarity, reason.
Like Socrates, maybe?
Arguably, yes. And then there's the Dionysian. That's the dark, visceral, wild, untamed, hard-to-grasp force emerging from our inner chaotic layers. It represents passion, intuition, the sublime, the stuff that's hard to pin down.
Get two opposing forces.
And Nietzsche argued that Socrates' huge influence led to an excessive rise of rationalism. It overemphasized the Apollonian, the rational, and tragically disrupted or suppressed the Dionysian. He called it yam without eating, like having only the male principle without the balancing female yin.
Severe imbalance, stifling a vital part of being human.
That was Nietzsche's fear. He believed this disruption, this over-reliance on pure reason, was a major problem. It stifled intuition, creativity, vitality, and he made this bold statement that ties right back to Fat Tony. What is not intelligible to me is not necessarily unintelligent.
There it is again.
Perhaps there is a realm of wisdom from which the logicians is exiled. This directly links to Taleb's core definition of the fragile person or system, the one that mistakes what it doesn't understand for nonsense, dismissing valuable insights just because they can't be neatly defined or logically proven.
Because they can't fit it in their rational box.
Right. And interestingly, Nietzsche was also one of the first to use the phrase creatively destructive and destructively creative, referencing the chaotic, transformative power of Dionysus. It shows he had this deep, intuitive grasp of anti-fragility way back then.
Understanding that growth needs chaos.
Yes. He understood that knowledge growth, cultural evolution, any real progress often requires that Dionysian element, the intuitive, the unpredictable, the non-rational, the ability to actually thrive on disorder, not just to find it away.
This really does shift how we think about knowledge itself. It's not just about what we can clearly define or rationalize. It's about respecting the limits of our own analytical tools.
And recognizing that some of the most profound wisdom is often, tacit, embodied, resistant to easy explanation.
What's fascinating here is seeing how consistent these counter-arguments to pure rationalism have been throughout history. It reinforces Fat Tony's practical stance. This isn't some new idea Taleb cooked up.
Not at all. The source highlights several other critics of this sort of naive rationalism and purely definitional knowledge. It shows this is a recurring tension in how humans think. Like, take Seneca, the Roman Stoic.
Okay.
He introduced a much richer picture of human drives than just Nietzsche's Apollonian-Dionysian split. He talked about strength, vitality, craft, reason, suggesting wisdom wasn't just about definitions, but about a more, robust and resilient way of living.
More dimensions to it.
Right. And then there's Ernst Renan, the 19th century French thinker. He famously declared that truth resides exclusively in the nuances and that logic is basically a useless instrument for finding truth in the moral and the political sciences.
Wow. Useless. That's strong.
It's a powerful statement against relying only on pure logic, especially in complex human affairs where emotions, traditions, biases all play huge roles. It echoes Fat Tony's skepticism about definitions for things like justice or piety.
And Cato the Elder in ancient Rome, he was allergic to Greek thinkers.
Deeply suspicious. He believes Socrates was literally destroying the foundations of society by undermining the traditional heuristics that are transmitted by the elders.
The accumulated unwritten wisdom.
Exactly. The practical know-how passed down through generations. Cato saw Socrates as trying to be a tyrant by dismantling this established working knowledge just because people couldn't perfectly define it. He feared losing that practical wisdom.
It's a powerful defense of that collective unspoken knowledge, which leads us to more modern thinkers who felt similarly, right? Like Edmund Burke.
Yeah, Burke, reacting against the French Revolution's radical top-down upheaval, he advocated for small triangle error experiments in society, basically. Small incremental changes that respect existing complex traditions and heuristics, rather than trying to impose some grand rational design.
Learn by doing. Carefully.
And Michael Oakeshott, who believed traditions provide an aggregation of filtered collective knowledge, a kind of wisdom embedded in practice, not explicit rules.
Then there's Wittgenstein.
Ludwig Wittgenstein, yeah. He constantly wrestled with the limits of language, deeply understanding that green lumber problem. He doubted language could ever fully capture the literal or the practical reality of things.
And Friedrich Hayek, the economist.
Hayek, famous for opposing central planning. He argued the price system in a free market spontaneously reveals distributed knowledge better than any planner could grasp. But as the source notes, Taleb thinks Hayek missed the notion of optionality as another vital, bottom-up way societies adapt and gain knowledge, not just through prices.
Interesting nuance.
And Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, he showed that so-called non-literate peoples had their own incredibly complex systems of thought, their own signs of the conflict, a holistic way of thinking that wasn't necessarily less coherent than Western scientific approaches. He showed the profound logic in traditional intuitive knowledge systems.
And finally, John Gray, the contemporary philosopher.
Gray consistently challenges human hubris, particularly the idea that the Enlightenment and scientific progress are some kind of cure-all, a panacea. He shows how scientific progress can be a mirage if it makes us blind to our own limits and the value of non-rational forms of wisdom.
So all these thinkers, spanning centuries, disciplines, they're all pointing towards the same core idea.
Pretty much. That there's this huge realm of effective action and deep wisdom that exists beyond what we can capture in neat definitions or purely rational explanations. It's about acknowledging the limits of our intellect, respecting tacit knowledge, respecting heuristics, the things we know how to do well, even if we can't fully explain why they work. This deep skepticism about purely definitional knowledge is absolutely central to Antifragile.
It's a really profound shift in perspective, isn't it? It moves us away from just chasing definable truth and into the realm of practical consequences. Payoff.
Exactly. Less about predicting the likelihood of something happening and much more about managing its potential impact if it does, especially the catastrophic impact.
That feels like a fundamentally different way to make decisions. Which brings us right back to Fat Tony's core philosophy. For him, life isn't about true or false.
Nope. It's sucker or non-sucker.
The payoff matters more.
And what's fascinating is how this directly confronts, centuries of Western philosophy, which has almost always put truth, rationality, logical consistency on a pedestal.
Above everything else.
Right. But for Tony, exposure is more important than knowledge. Decision effects supersede logic. He gets intuitively that just knowing about something doesn't protect you from what it can do to you.
The consequences.
The source says the payoff from your actions, instead of studying the structure of the world, has been largely missed in intellectual history. That's a huge claim. But his point is, what happens to you is always the most important thing, not the event in itself. It's a radical shift from the theoretical to the brutally practical.
So philosophers might debate truth and falsehood in their ivory towers.
While people actually living life, navigating the messiness, they're talking about payoff, exposure, and consequences, and fragility and anti-fragility.
And Taleb argues that true and false, hence what we call belief, play a poor secondary role in human decisions. It's the payoff from the true and false that dominates. And crucially, it is almost always asymmetric, with one consequence much bigger than the other.
That asymmetry is key. It means the simple truth of a statement or the probability of an event often pales in comparison to the potential impact of acting on it or being exposed to it.
That really crystallizes it. If the payoff is asymmetric, if being wrong is way worse than being right is good, then focusing on the fragility of the situation rather than just its probability becomes the only rational thing to do.
It's about deciding principally based on fragility, not so much on true or false beliefs or probabilities. It's almost like a primal, built-in understanding of risk. Survival instinct, maybe?
This is a massive shift in perspective, then. Forget how probable something is. Focus on how catastrophic it would be if it did happen. That's a total game changer for daily decisions, surely. From small stuff to huge life choices.
Absolutely. And we do it instinctively all the time, even if we don't label it that way. The source gives some great examples. Think about airport security.
Okay, yeah.
We check every single person for weapons. Why? Not because we think any random individual is likely to be a terrorist. Statistically, the odds are minuscule.
Right, incredibly low probability.
But we do it because society is incredibly fragile to terrorism. The potential payoff of one successful attack, the loss of life, the economic chaos, the fear is just too enormous. And the cost of checking, relatively speaking, is low. So we act to protect against that catastrophic downside, regardless of its low probability.
We act against fragility, not probability. That makes perfect sense. What about nuclear reactors? They seem super safe, usually.
Same principle. We spend fortunes, billions, on safety systems for nuclear reactors. Multiple redundancies, fail-safes, containment structures. Why? Not because we think a meltdown is likely next year.
The probability is tiny, hopefully.
Exactly, because of those safety measures. But we spend the money because society is profoundly fragile to nuclear events. The potential payoff of a major accident, the devastation, the long-term contamination is just too high to contemplate, no matter how improbable it seems on any given Tuesday.
Okay.
And it applies personally, too. Like, would you swallow a random pill you found on the street just because it's probably harmless?
No way.
Of course not, because the potential negative payoff poisoning severe side effects is way too high, even if the probability of harm is actually quite low. You instinctively avoid the catastrophic downside.
So it's always about avoiding the disaster, not just accurately predicting the everyday. Which makes you think, that whole scientific idea of a confidence level, like 95% confident, it feels almost useless here.
You've hit on a really critical point Taleb makes. The source highlights the inefficiency of just using true false or standard scientific confidence levels for real-world decisions, precisely because they ignore the size of effect.
The magnitude of the consequence.
Right. Which, of course, makes things even worse when you're dealing with extreme events, with extremistan. A scientist saying they're 95% confident means there's a 5% chance they're wrong. Okay, fine. But that tells you nothing about the consequence if they're wrong in that 5% of cases.
If that 5% chance means, like, the entire financial system collapses, suddenly 95% confidence doesn't sound so reassuring.
Not at all. It's like that manager in the source, the guy who rode his bike for 15 years without a helmet. He thought he was 100% right in his observation that it was safe because nothing has happened to him.
Basing his truth entirely on past luck.
Exactly. But Taleb's point is, one single random event and he will be no more. That's where the Lindy effect comes in. But in reverse, for fragile things. For something fragile like a human skull hitting pavement, past survival doesn't guarantee future survival at all.
In fact, maybe the longer it's gone without breaking, the closer it is to its breaking point.
That's the unsettling implication for fragile things. Every day survived without incident might actually increase the cumulative risk or bring it closer to failure. Or think about a plane crash. Someone tells you there's a 99% confidence level that the plane is safe for your flight.
Still feels a bit worrying.
Right, because that 1% probability, if it happens, has enormous irreversible consequences for you. Most people in daily life, we don't really compute probabilities like that unless maybe you're at a casino or doing specific calculations. As the source puts it, probability does not work in real world. It is the payoff that matters. Our brains seem wired for consequences, especially negative ones, not for accurately calculating the odds of rare events.
And this connects back powerfully to the green lumber fallacy again, and how we should think about black swans. It's the idea that the impact of a black swan, how it affects your money, your life, your emotions, is totally different from the event itself.
Yes, and we tend to focus on predicting the event.
That's the crucial error Taleb points out. Predictors, academics, policy wonks, they often make this mistake. They focus on better computation in order to predict the event better and figure out the probabilities. They want more data, better models, finer forecasts.
Trying to pin down the unpredictable.
But Taleb argues the vastly more effective approach is completely different. It's to modify your exposure and learn to get out of trouble. Focus on your response, your resilience, not the prediction.
And he notes that actually traditional wisdom, religious heuristics, they've often implicitly done this for centuries, guided people to manage their exposure to the unknown, to build buffers, to avoid catastrophic risks, rather than trying to perfectly predict every little thing.
Which raises that important question you mentioned. Are we even asking the right questions if we're obsessed only with prediction instead of resilience?
It's about building systems, personal systems, societal systems that can actually thrive on disorder or at least withstand it robustly. Systems that are anti-fragile, not just trying to forecast the unpredictable or merely tolerate shocks.
And this critique, this focus on fragility and exposure, leads us right into the final and maybe the most provocative section of our deep dive today. The fragility of institutions, particularly Taleb's critical look at modern education.
Yeah, he and his sources are definitely not pulling any punches here. The argument is that many of our most revered institutions are built on assumptions that actually make them incredibly fragile when faced with real-world complexity.
The core claim seems to be that doing is wiser than you are prone to believe and more rational. It's a huge argument for practical, hands-on, experiential knowledge over the purely theoretical or academic stuff.
It's about debunking that idea of experts lecturing birds how to fly. The argument presented is stark. There is apparently no empirical evidence to support the statement that organized research in the sense it is currently marketed leads to the great things promised by universities and the promoters of the Soviet Harvard idea.
Wow, Soviet Harvard. That's quite a phrase. He's suggesting that much of the progress we attribute to these big organized research efforts might actually be, what? Luck, serendipity, individual tinkering.
or the result of individual, often rebellious, nonconformist efforts that happen despite the system, not because of it. It's a direct challenge to the perceived value add of purely academic, theoretical knowledge in driving real-world innovation and progress.
And a key reason for this skepticism, according to the source, is the absence of optionality in how these institutions work and their reliance on teleological science. What does it mean?
Right. The argument is that these institutions, especially big universities and research bodies, they do not use optionality or later or second order effects. They tend to operate on these linear planned models. They set out specific goals and try to reach them directly.
Which misses the point that real innovation often happens by accident, through unexpected spin-offs.
Exactly. It misses the nonlinear, unpredictable ways that real breakthroughs occur, often through playing around, trial and error, exploiting unexpected positive side effects. That's optionality. And teleological science, in this context, means science driven by a specific, predetermined end goal.
Like, we will cure X disease by 2030.
Kind of. Rather than allowing for discovery that emerges organically from experimentation, from exploring weird avenues, from chance. Taleb argues this planned approach invalidates their view about the role of teleological science because, true, game-changing progress often comes from those unexpected places, not the meticulous 5-year plans.
And then the critique gets even sharper, moving into what Taleb provocatively calls the scam of higher education. The source flat out says Ivy League universities are often treated as a status, luxury good.
Yeah, explicitly compared to a Louis Vuitton bag or a Cartier watch.
Ouch. That's brutal.
It's a stark comparison, isn't it? Suggesting that the immense perceived value and the price tag of these institutions is often more about signaling status, gaining access to elite networks, and getting that credential than it is about the actual knowledge acquired or its contribution to society's overall advancement.
And this creates a huge drag on the middle-class parent, right? Pouring savings into these institutions.
Exactly. Pouring an increased share of their savings into these institutes for their kids. Buying into a narrative that might not deliver proportional value back to society as a whole, even if it helps the individual kid get a certain type of job.
And where does the money go? The source calls them rent extractors.
Yeah, the argument is the money is automatically transferred to these rent extractors, administrators, real estate developers involved in campus expansion, sometimes professors, other agents who benefit from the massively inflated costs and the student loan system. The whole process is even likened to racketeering.
That is an incredibly strong accusation, suggesting a systemic extraction of wealth without necessarily producing the anti-fragile progress or genuine broad-based knowledge society actually needs.
It certainly is. And while the source acknowledges that, okay, maybe individuals feel they need that decent university name to get ahead, to secure a job in the current system,
Right, playing the game as it exists.
the collective argument is stark. Society doesn't appear to advance with organized education in the way its promoters claim it does. The progress might be happening elsewhere, or through different mechanisms entirely.
Which leads to that really provocative closing question in this section. Which scam in history has lasted forever?
Yeah, that implies that the current state of higher education, particularly the unchecked growth, the escalating costs, the potential disconnect from real-world value creation, is itself fragile.
Because it's been growing without external stresses. Like, it hasn't been truly tested by reality.
Exactly. It hasn't faced real pressure to adapt to prove its value in a truly competitive, consequence-driven way. And therefore, the implication is it might eventually collapse or undergo radical transformation.
Okay, so, wow. What does this all mean for us? For learners, for parents trying to make decisions, for citizens funding these systems through taxes or loans? It sounds like the takeaway is we need to be much more critical.
Definitely more critical, more discerning about how knowledge is acquired, how it's valued, and maybe look beyond the traditional established avenues for what truly provides anti-fragility, genuine skills, and real progress.
It's about being aware of the hidden fragilities, even in systems that look incredibly stable and prestigious on the surface.
And understanding that what seems efficient or true or the best on paper might not actually be robust when faced with real-world chaos and those extreme, unpredictable events. It really pushes us to prioritize outcomes, resilience, practical skills, tacit knowledge.
Over just intellectual clarity, fancy definitions, or perceived status.
It's a call to action, really, urging us to question the established norms, to maybe experiment more, and to seek out genuine, robust value wherever it might be found, even if it's not in the usual places.
So today, we've really taken a deep dive into anti-fragility. We explored the surprising counterintuitive wisdom of the barbell strategy, that blueprint for navigating uncertainty.
Then we witnessed that fantastic philosophical clash between the theoretical Socrates and the ultra-practical Fat Tony that really forced us to reconsider the whole notion of truth versus payoff in making decisions.
Shifting focus from probability to consequences. And finally, we saw how these powerful ideas extend to some pretty critical views on established institutions, especially higher education, challenging their value and exposing potential fragilities.
And throughout, the discussion really highlights the immense, often overlooked value of those unreasonable mavericks, engineers, freelance entrepreneurs, innovative artists, and anti-academic thinkers who have been reviled by history.
The outsiders, the tinkerers, the ones who didn't follow the script.
Exactly. These were the individuals who had the courage to live in a world they knew they didn't fully understand, and yet they managed not just to survive, but often to enjoy it and thrive. Frequently, by following these kinds of intuitive, anti-fragile strategies, even if they couldn't articulate them in academic terms.
So, considering all of this, it leaves you with a final thought, doesn't it? What unspoken intuitive truths might you be living by? Things that guide you effectively through life's messiness, but that you maybe can't quite articulate or define.
What practical, unarticulated wisdom, those joys of ignorance Fat Tony mentioned, might we unknowingly sacrifice in our relentless modern quest for perfect, definitional clarity about everything?
It's definitely something to ponder. We encourage you to think about these ideas, look for those barbell opportunities in your own life, places where you can secure your downside while opening yourself up to potentially unlimited upside.
And perhaps, like Fat Tony, start to question the questions themselves sometimes. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.